his self-esteem is very low and very fragile, and he may not even know that. If he has ASD level 1, it comes from not quite being able to fit in. We're talking about way back in childhood. Couldn't quite fit in, was maybe ostracized by peers, rejected, bullied, teased, whatever. If he has ASD level 1, he's going to have mind blindness. It's going to be difficult for him to understand the motives of other people and why they behave the way they do. And unfortunately, if you don't know, you will fill in the blank with something negative. That's very popular for the ASD child and young adult and full-blown adult to negatively spin behavior that's not understood and motivation that's not understood. And he's also going to grow up going through life, if he has ASD level 1, not understanding his emotions or the emotions of others. He is going to have some executive function deficits. He's going to have anxiety as a result. He may also have sensory sensitivity, all of these things. So he has grown up, let's put it like this, where social contact, unless it was with people that were doing something very similar to what he was doing in his special interest area, social relationships were just fucking messy. They were messy. Could never quite figure out, how do I deal with this person? What am I doing wrong? No matter what I say or do, it's like there's a disconnect. To put in the context of the neurotypical wife, doesn't matter what I say or do, it's never good enough. I want to make her happy, but I just don't seem to make her happy. So, and I've had guys that tell me, I've had a few guys say, well, no, I think my self-esteem is pretty much intact. But when I do a little further investigation, they don't really know what high self-esteem looks like because their self-esteem has always been low. If you grow up in a dark room and then somebody comes in one day, and let's say you're 50 years old, and says, wow, your room is really dark. And you go, what do you mean? It's always been like this. This is the norm. Another thing that many guys will tell me, but I don't feel particularly anxious. I don't think I have anxiety. Okay, well, when was the last time you shut down? Oh, well, earlier this morning. Okay, so if you don't have anything to contrast it with, you've always had chronic low-grade anxiety from pretty much day one, and you've always had low self-esteem for pretty much day two, you don't have any way to contrast, to compare. Well, I had high self-esteem and now I have low, so now I can tell that right now it's low or high. Or I've always been calm, but now I'm kind of anxious, and so I can see, I'm anxious because usually I'm calm. Since even some of your neutral comments are not totally understood due to mind blindness and emotions blindness and executive function deficits, he, whoever he is, if he doesn't understand your motives, your behavior, why you're saying what you're saying, why you're feeling the way you feel, he will fill in the blank with something that is usually negative. In fact, I will say always negative. If I don't understand this thing, I'm going to fill in the blank with something. I'm going to give it my best guess, and it's going to be a negative spin for sure. It's going to be a negative reframe of your behavior, and so now I think that you're against me. I think you're out to get me. I think you're being parental. I think you're chastising me. I think that you think that I'm defective and flawed, and you're trying to correct me and fix me.
He knows that he sucks at social skills because he probably learned that as a child. And so if you were a little kid and your parents signed you up for Little League or T-ball or whatever, and you just didn't have the knack for that, and you got benched, you just basically sucked. So you ended up kind of being the bat boy, and it was a terrible experience. I'm never playing baseball again. I suck at that. I was never any good at it. They started me way out in the outfield, and then the coach wasn't even happy with me way out there, and he just benched me, and I just sat on the bench the entire season. So now that I have been benched by the coach, and I know that I'm not a good baseball player, and then somebody comes along and says, oh, well, would you like to join this team and learn how to play baseball? It's like, no, I've already been around that block. I suck at it. No. I don't have any interest in learning baseball or learning how to be a better pitcher or a better batter, and I'm perfectly fine not playing baseball. And so that's exactly what's going on with your husband, is that he knows he's terrible at it. He's had a bad experience with it, and talking is a social activity. Of course he doesn't want to talk. And it's a shame that he feels that way, because social skills can be taught, and the give and take in conversation can be taught. And he would actually get to the point where he would probably enjoy conversing and enjoy talking, because he's actually doing it fairly adeptly for the first time in his life. So he might even find some joy in having conversation about something other than his topic of interest.
I get a lot of NT wives that say, well, when we first started dating, my yet-to-be husband just did a lot of masking and presented himself as someone other than who he really was. And it was kind of deceitful. But I can promise you that your now ASD husband never had the thought of, well, I really like this girl, I want to date her, and I'm going to be deceitful and present myself as being somebody else. And then when I get comfortable with her and have her trapped, I'll just go back to my old way of behaving. Masking is not manipulation. Rather, it is a cover-up for shame, specifically a cover-up for toxic shame and toxic guilt. Healthy guilt is, I did something wrong. I didn't necessarily mean to do it, but now in retrospect, I see it was hurtful. I want to learn from this mistake. I intend not to repeat this mistake. I'm going to make amends and move forward. Toxic guilt, though, is I'm always making these social mistakes. I'm always hurting her. I'm always letting her down. I never seem to get it right. Doesn't matter what I say or do, it's never good enough. This in turn leads to toxic shame, which is because I'm always making these mistakes repeatedly and can never seem to learn from my mistakes. Therefore, I am a mistake. And so his social awkwardness becomes an identity. And he's embarrassed by that. And he purposely tries to hide that out of a sense of shame. In other words, he's thinking, if people knew who I really was, they wouldn't like me, I wouldn't be lovable, I wouldn't be acceptable, I would live the rest of my life alone. In other words, I can't really let my true colors show, because if I do, I will be rejected, ostracized, maybe even teased and bullied. I will never measure up. I'll never have what it takes to make it in the social world. So this so-called masking is a shame cover-up, not a manipulation, although I admit that from the NT female brain perspective, it certainly seems as if it's a manipulation. And he's a con man of sorts. And the reason that he changes his colors once the relationship has some mileage on it is because he's comfortable now with his NT partner. He lets down his guard because he feels that finally it's okay just to be myself. But unfortunately, after years of being chastised and reprimanded, which is how he would view it, he realizes yet again, I can't really truly relax and just be me. So this defensiveness that you see in him and these neutral comments or constructive criticisms that he downloads as an attack are the direct result of toxic shame. Feelings of not being good enough, yet again being reprimanded, looked down on, and told in no uncertain terms that he's not good enough. So what I do instead, I disconnect from people because they rarely accept me, and I connect with my special interest because it always accepts me.
I'm a big believer in facing the truth. I would rather be hurt by the truth than blinded by bullshit. I've always been that way. And I had an NT wife email me today. Well, you could use neurodiverse instead of autism spectrum disorder because, these guys are sensitive, and I think that my husband is real sensitive, and he doesn't want to, admit that he might have this disorder. And so you've heard of this term, right? Neurodiverse, and it's a politically correct term, and it would, be a little more sensitive. So duly noted, but I don't think you guys are that fragile that I have to be. I'm not really into being politically correct. Plus, I use neurodiversity to describe the couples. When I say neurodiverse couples, I mean one has autism, one does not. So the reason I'm not willing to use neurodiverse for you guys is because there's no shame involved. To use neurodiverse to kind of sugarcoat it a little bit implies that there's something to be ashamed of. No. Period. ASD level 1 is what we're referring to now. There's 2 other levels. It has to do with levels of functioning. You're already aware of that. You guys are all ASD level 1, which is high functioning. So think of ASD level 1 as simply I don't like the term disorder, though, I will tell you that. Because there again, that sounds like there's something wrong or bad or to be ashamed of. So I do not like the term disorder. So I guess I do want to be politically correct on that. I prefer to call it a condition or a different way of thinking because I think that's more in alignment with the reality of things. And you could think of it as a condition of social skills being low, social needs being low, logic being high. And that's kind of your saving grace. That is your strength, your logic. We wouldn't have this computer we're talking on right now if we didn't have somebody on the autism spectrum, Asperger's syndrome, and back in that day, Bill Gates. The engineering field is full of people on the spectrum. Computer sciences, they're all over the place. It's almost a stretch to call you guys in the minority because there's so many undiagnosed people crawling around all over the planet. If we could get to the bottom of things, we might find that 30% or 40% of people, the entire people on the planet, are on the spectrum. That sounds like a bizarre exaggeration. It's not, because there's a lot of people that have these traits, but nobody has put 2 and 2 together yet or done some research and thought, hey, maybe you have this thing called ASD level 1. They just go on with life and they don't even entertain the idea. So there's more people that have it than have been diagnosed with it or that even have talked about it.
So in working with adults on the autism spectrum, sometimes we get into this business of attribution retraining, and that's a fancy term for basically helping individuals who have mind blindness, alexithymia, and other traits of the disorder such as executive function deficits and so on, helps these individuals to check the evidence before reacting. Because if you are a spouse of someone on the autism spectrum, you may have been in a situation where you've said something that in your mind was totally 100% neutral and harmless, but it downloaded in his mind as criticism, or that you're being controlling or something along those lines. So one common effect of misinterpretation for people on the autism spectrum is the development of distrust in others. And honestly, in some cases, it's even what I would refer to as a mild form of paranoia. And this is largely due to impaired theory of mind skills in the cognitive profile of these individuals on the autism spectrum. Now, a theory of mind is the ability that we all have in order to make sense of the world we live in. Every person's thoughts, knowledge, beliefs, desires, and so on make up his or her own unique theory of mind. Now, people on the autism spectrum have difficulty conceptualizing and appreciating the thoughts and feelings of others. And this is called mind blindness. And it's this mind blindness thing that makes it difficult for these individuals to be able to relate to and understand the behaviors of you, the NT spouse, and others as well, co-workers, other family members, and so on. By failing to account for others' perspectives, individuals on the autism spectrum tend to misinterpret their messages. And for the NT spouses listening to this video, you've lived it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Mind blindness also means that the individual with ASD level 1 has difficulty in distinguishing whether someone's actions are intentional or accidental. Okay? So neurotypical people will know from the context, body language, facial cues, and character of the other person involved that the intent was not to cause distress, injury, criticism, but people on the autism spectrum often focus primarily on the act and the consequences. For example, he bumped into me and it hurt, and so it was intentional. Whereas neurotypical people would consider the circumstances. For example, he was running, he tripped, he accidentally fell into me. So the neurotypical is able to fill in the blank with something that makes a little more sense than conclusion jumping. With individuals on the high end of autism, there may need to be training in this business of checking the evidence before overreacting to the event or the person in question. And this training is called attribution training. The mind-blind individual often blames others exclusively and tends not to consider his own contribution, or he can excessively blame himself for the events. So it could be attributed on either extreme. Now, one aspect of ASD is a tendency for some of these individuals to adopt an attitude of arrogance, where the perceived focus of control is always external. So when the ASD individual believes that he was a victim of some form of injustice, the perpetrator, in this case would be the NT spouse, may be held responsible and become the target for punishment or chastisement or a long lecture, or be on the receiving end of a shutdown or meltdown. So people on the autism spectrum have considerable difficulty accepting that they themselves have contributed to an event. But again, the opposite can occur, where he has extremely low self-esteem and feels personally responsible for too many things, which results in feelings of anxiety and guilt. So in other words, he's either taking on too much responsibility for the issue, or he's deflecting and not taking any responsibility for the issue in question. So attribution training involves establishing the reality of the situation, the various participants' contributions to an incident, and determining how the individual on the autism spectrum can change his or her perception and response. A part of social skills training for this individual will revolve around how he attributes his success, and will likely require some attribution retraining to take place. So this is where the therapist, for example, retrains the individual to think about his success as something he actively influences, not something of which he is a victim. Now, there are 4 main factors to which we can attribute success or failure, and those are effort, ability, luck, and task difficulty. So we'll look at each of these in turn. A person attributing effort may say something along the lines of, I worked hard and that's why I did so good, or I was lazy and that's why I didn't accomplish my goal. So here I am attributing effort to the outcome. A person attributing ability may say something along the lines of, I'm so stupid, that's why I failed, or I'm so intelligent and that's why I succeeded. So here I would be attributing the outcome to my ability. A person attributing luck may say something along the lines of, I was wearing my lucky shirt today, and so that's why I won the game, or I wasn't wearing my lucky shirt today and that's why I lost the game. So here I'm attributing luck to the outcome. And lastly, there's task difficulty. So if I'm attributing task difficulty, I may say something along the lines of, the test was so easy, that's why I passed, or the test was really super hard and that's why I failed. So there I'm attributing task difficulty to the outcome. You know, people don't have any control over luck or task difficulty, and ability is gained through gaining knowledge and skills. So therefore, the only aspect that people can directly influence on a regular basis is their effort. And this is where attribution training takes place. So the individual on the autism spectrum who adopts an effort-based belief gains an internal locus of control, which means he believes he is in control of circumstances, and he subsequently feels empowered. Now, this is where the individual comes to believe that he has enough ability that with effort, he can be successful. And that is attribution training. Cognitive restructuring enables people on the autism spectrum to correct distorted conceptualizations and dysfunctional beliefs. The process involves challenging their current thinking with logical evidence and ensuring the rationalization and cognitive control of their emotions. Now, the first stage of cognitive restructuring is to establish the evidence for a particular belief. People on the autism spectrum often make false assumptions of their circumstances and the intentions of others, and they have a tendency to make a literal interpretation, and a casual comment may be taken out of context or may be taken to the extreme. All people are vulnerable to distorted conceptualizations, but people on the autism spectrum are less able to put things in perspective, to seek clarification, and to consider alternative explanations or responses. So neurotypical spouses can encourage their autistic spouse to be more flexible in their thinking and to seek clarification using questions or comments such as, "Are you joking?" or "I'm confused about what you just said." Such comments also can be used when misinterpreting someone's intentions, such as, "Did you do that deliberately?" And to rescue the situation after they've made an inappropriate response with a comment such as, "I'm sorry I offended you," or, "Oh, what should I have done instead?" One common effect of misinterpretation is the development of paranoia. The person on the autism spectrum can have difficulty distinguishing between accidental or deliberate intent. Now, neurotypical people will know from the context, body language, and character of the other person involved that the intent was not to cause distress or injury. However, people on the spectrum can focus primarily on the act and the consequence. So people on the spectrum may need to be trained in checking the evidence before responding and developing more accurate mind-reading skills. Cognitive restructuring also includes a process known as attribution retraining. The person on the spectrum may blame others exclusively and not consider his own contribution, or he can excessively blame himself for events. One aspect of ASD is a tendency for some people to adopt an attitude of arrogance or omnipotence where the perceived focus of control is external. For example, the person may have the thought, "I have no control," rather, outside circumstances control me. Specific individuals are held responsible and become the target for retribution or punishment, and these individuals have considerable difficulty accepting that they themselves have contributed to the event. The opposite can occur when the person on the spectrum has extremely low self-esteem and feels personally responsible, which results in feelings of anxiety and guilt. Attribution retraining involves establishing the reality of the situation, the various participants' contributions to an incident, and determining how the individual can change his perception and response. While it's a widely known fact that obsessive-compulsive disorder is often a comorbid condition with Asperger's or high-functioning autism, another fact that is not well known is that OCD is less prominent in individuals on the spectrum than the obsessions by themselves, kind of a OD, if you will. So what we're going to do in this section is we're going to talk about obsessive thinking in the Asperger's mind, or in the mind of the individual on the high end of autism. But before we get into obsessive thinking and what can be done about it, let's first draw the distinction between obsession versus compulsion. Now, both of these terms involve a disorder, and this may give an impression that both obsession and compulsion are alike, but actually they're considerably different. Obsession is a mental disorder that refers to the repetitive ideas or impulses in a person's mind. And although most of the time the ideas and impulses in the mind would involve a desire that is waiting to be satisfied, there are times that these ideas and impulses are unwanted, making that person with an obsession somewhat mentally unbalanced. The impulses and ideas may also be persistent. Even though the person with an obsession doesn't want to think about the particular obsession that he has, the ideas still keep popping in his mind. Also, the person with an obsession can have further problems if he refuses to think about that particular impulse or idea. Although the individual with an obsession is busy with other sorts of things, this idea or obsession would still recur, and usually it would disrupt the thinking of the individual. On the other hand, a compulsion, even though it's also a mental disorder, has more to do with action and behavior rather than thinking. Think of compulsion as the actual task that the individual performs. So while the obsession would involve impulses or ideas, a compulsion would involve the behavior based on the obsession. The person with a compulsion repeats a particular action that she is fixated on, and this repetitive action then becomes somewhat of a daily ritual for the individual with the compulsion. The person with an obsession would be comparable to a CD in a CD player, and it keeps skipping over the same spot. If the person refuses to think about that particular obsession, he can't stop because it just keeps skipping. Furthermore, if the person would refuse to think of that particular idea or impulse, he would be further disturbed, which would also result in a much more complicated mental dilemma here. On the other hand, a compulsion would be very comparable to a machine that is programmed to do the same thing over and over again. An obsession could actually result in a compulsion. For example, an individual who has a compulsion of hand washing might also be obsessed with being clean. Now, as I stated earlier, obsessing is a lot like a CD that just keeps skipping over the same spot. But it's not just any kind of thought. It's a thought that is usually related to a past event that was relationship-oriented. It's, for example, replaying an argument with a friend in your mind, retracing your past mistakes, going back and ruminating about some of the injustices that you've had to endure, and so on. When people obsess, they overthink or ruminate about situations or life events, and these could be work-related, relationship-related, family of origin-related, and so on. Now, research has shown that obsessive thinking is associated with a variety of negative emotional states. For example, depression, anxiety, and also it's associated with a lot of negative behaviors. For example, binge drinking and binge eating. So why would obsessive thinking lead to these negative outcomes? Well, for some individuals, drinking or binge eating becomes a way to cope with life and drown out their obsessive thinking. When people obsess while they're in a depressed mood, they remember more negative things that happened to them in the past. They interpret situations in their current lives more negatively, and they are just in general more hopeless about the future. Obsessive thinking also becomes the fast track to feeling helpless. Specifically, it paralyzes your problem-solving skills. You become so preoccupied with the problem that you're unable to push past the cycle of negative thoughts. It can even turn people away. When people obsess for an extended period of time, their family members and friends become frustrated, and they may pull away their support. So why do individuals on the spectrum tend to engage in more obsessive thinking than those without any form of autism? Well, some obsessive individuals may simply have more stress and anxiety in their lives, and so they're preoccupied with that. For others, it may be an issue of cognition. Some people prone to obsess have basic problems pushing things out of consciousness once they get there. So now let's shift gears and look at how the individual on the spectrum can reduce his or her obsessive thinking. And I think it goes without saying at this point that you would want to reduce obsessive thinking since it causes so many emotional and behavioral problems. There are essentially two steps to stop or at least minimize obsessive thinking. One of the first steps would be to problem solve. People who obsess not only replay situations in their head, they also focus on abstract questions like, why do these things happen to me? Why do I have to be in this situation? What's wrong with me that I can't cope? Why do these people mistreat me? And so on. So even if they consider solving the situation, they conclude that there's nothing that I can do about it, and so they give up. And that's a mistake. A lot of adults on the spectrum and even teenagers and perhaps even some younger children have tried to fix their social relationships. They couldn't do it and they quit trying. Okay? But if you can think clearly, you'll be able to identify at least one concrete thing that you can do to overcome the problem that you're obsessing about. For example, if you're uneasy about a situation at work, then commit to calling a close friend so that the two of you can brainstorm some solutions. Okay? So that is the first thing to do. Problem solve, but you're probably going to have to seek some outside assistance to get this accomplished. It could be a therapist, a pastor, a job coach. The bottom line is find someone who can help you in the task of problem solving. And the second course of action here would be to engage in activities that promote positive thoughts. You need to engage in activities that can fill your mind with other thoughts, preferably positive thoughts. That could be anything from a favorite physical activity to a hobby, to meditation, to prayer. The main thing is to get your mind off your obsessive thinking for a time so that it dies out and doesn't have a grip on your mind. So, another way of saying this would be find some distraction. And a lot of people on the spectrum are good at this. They engage in one activity for lengthy periods of time to the exclusion of most other activities. And this does annoy family members and so on. But what they're really doing, without even knowing it, is they're distracting themselves from obsessive thinking. And in this case, it's probably a good coping skill. So the first course of action, get into problem-solving mode, find somebody to help you with that. Second course of action, engage in activities that promote positive thoughts. And something that ties into this business of fostering positive thinking has to do with adaptive self-reflection. When people practice adaptive self-reflection, they focus on the concrete parts of the situation and the improvements they can make. It's a very objective versus subjective approach. For example, the person may wonder, what exactly did my boss say to me yesterday that was so upsetting to me? And then the individual can come up with a statement like, I could ask my boss to talk with me about how I could get a better performance evaluation, or I may talk to some of my coworkers and get their feedback on ways that I can improve and so on. So, adaptive self-reflection, it actually ties in both the promoting of positive thinking and the problem solving here, okay? So what you're doing is you're not ruminating in the sense that you're replaying this tape in your head about how you were mistreated. Let's draw the distinction between ruminating and self-reflection. Ruminating is I'm replaying a tape of a bad event, and every time I play it, I feel even worse. And even though the event maybe only happened one time, it feels like it's happened 100 times. Self-reflection, however, is I'm going to keep my thinking positive. I'm going to get in problem-solving mode. What happened, and what can I do to go back and recruit the assistance of somebody else to problem solve such that I don't repeat this mistake in the future or run into this problem with my coworker again and so on like that. We really have to talk about the amygdala, which, as many of you know, is just a part of your brain. But it's more than just any old part. It is the fear center of the brain. It helped us survive back in the day, quite honestly. And people with Asperger's syndrome do tend to have an overly active and even in some cases physically enlarged amygdala. And so that would explain briefly, why they have such anxiety. The disorder comes with anxiety, but also they grew up in an environment that reinforced that anxiety, namely knowing that they just could not fit in socially. The link between the amygdala and fear processing does indeed shed a lot of light on how anxiety can take root in a child's mind, the child having high-functioning autism or Asperger's, and then develop into long-term problems as an adult. Now, the link between the amygdala and anxiety served us really well back, 2 million years ago, when we were cavemen and we were facing life-threatening dangers every day. So let's say, for example, you encountered a saber-toothed tiger, and this tiger greeted you with a very loud, threatening growl, and his big incisor teeth were glaring at you, and so your amygdala would jump into action and trigger a fear response rather than encouraging you to go over there and pet the kitty, right? So in this case, you would either fight or flee or hide. But in addition, since this experience was accompanied by strong emotions, it would also be processed into a lifelong memory. So in other words, the next time you left your hut or your cave or whatever, you would generalize. In other words, you would know that all tigers, not only the one you met, are dangerous. And you, therefore, would wisely avoid being around them. Now, this was very useful back then. But in modern life, it creates a huge problem, especially if you're already hardwired to have an overly active amygdala like people on the autism spectrum and all across the spectrum have. So now fast forward to today, a child with high functioning autism or Asperger's is unfortunate to experience unsuccessful attempts at making friends, keeping friends, and socializing. In many cases, he wants to make friends, he just can't quite fit in, and so he gets ostracized, rejected, ridiculed, and even bullied. The uncomfortable feelings this will inevitably produce, coupled with the memory processing of the amygdala, will unfortunately start a vicious cycle of generalization and avoidance behavior. And what this means is the child will associate people with distressing emotions, and that'll stimulate anxiety, which will in turn reduce the child's ability to interact with people and interpret their behaviors positively. So when I say he generalizes, he in essence makes a thinking error that because these one or two people mistreated me, therefore all people will mistreat me. Now you fast forward to adulthood, where this person is trying to get into a romantic relationship with a neurotypical. He's already on guard. He's already been through a lifetime of rejection and ridicule, and now he's in the situation where he has to be highly social, which is not his cup of tea. And since he struggles socially, relationship problems inevitably occur. And as his partner tries to correct the relationship, sometimes this gets downloaded in his brain, the Asperger's brain, as criticism, and he has flashbacks to previous criticism, and so he is quick to feel like he's being yet again ridiculed, put down, and made to feel like shit. You could think of your Asperger's husband in this case as someone who has a severe sunburn. And you know, when you've ever had a severe sunburn, just a touch, just a mild touch by somebody else leaves you screaming. And so your Asperger's husband has already suffered some emotional damage from social failures previously in his life. And so now the slightest touch, in other words, the slightest positive or even constructive criticism, will be felt as painful criticism and put-downs. I hope that makes sense. And at the very least, maybe you can understand why he is so super sensitive to criticism.
One of the first things you need to begin to do is think in terms of relationships first, my passion second. Relationships first, my passion second. Your relationships would be obviously relationship with your wife, with your children, with your close family members and close friends. Your passion would be your employment, if that's where your passion is, or a particular hobby. Now, what I mean by this whole business of relationship first is if the first thing that you do in the morning is get up and go make a cup of coffee, now the first thing you're going to do is you're going to kiss your wife on the cheek and tell her good morning. If the first thing that you do at lunchtime is take off down to Subway and get a Subway sandwich, now the first thing you're going to do at lunchtime is you're going to call your wife in the event that she can take a phone call and check in with her to see how her day's going. If the first thing that you do when you get home is say hi to your wife as you pass her in the hallway on the way to check your emails, or first thing you do when you get home is to read the newspaper, now the first thing you're going to do when you get home is give your wife a hug and ask her how her day went. If the first thing that you do on Saturday morning is get up and go out into the garage and tinker with your grandfather clock collection, now the first thing you're going to do on Saturday morning is take your wife to breakfast. You get the point here, right? Some of you are saying, I can't do that. No, you can do that. It's not a question of whether you can or can't. It's a question of whether you will or won't. How hard are you willing to work on this relationship? If you're serious about this, you will put relationships first and your passion second. Now, I'm not saying do away with your passion, and I'm not suggesting that now you want your passion to be your wife. Let's be realistic. If your passion is, for example, reading, and you really enjoy staying up on politics, or you have a strong interest in the stock market, I'm not going to be able to stand up here and convince you to be less passionate about that. So I'm not talking about switching passions. I'm talking about first things first. I'm talking about what you spend the most time with and what you spend time doing first. Now, a lot of men will tell me, they'll say, well, my wife is the most important thing to me. Oh, really? Well, if I were to follow you around all day with a video camera and video you doing your daily tasks, what would I see? Would I see you spending most of the day with your wife? Or would I see you spending most of your time in a solitary activity and your wife is nowhere to be found? You're either at work or on the computer, or you're reading, or you're engaged in a favorite hobby or whatever. So the true asset test regarding what is most important to you is what you spend the most time doing. If you're not willing to put relationships first and your passion second, then you're not serious about mending this relationship, and your wife is eventually going to pick up on that, and she probably will leave you. And are you in a position to start over again? Do you really want to start dating all over again? Do you really want to get married again? Chances are that if you get divorced, statistically speaking, you will live alone the rest of your life. Are you really willing to gamble like this? Your relationship with your wife should be a major priority. And how you do that is relationship first. Have a conversation. Give a hug, a kiss on a cheek, a pat on the back, a question about how her day was going. Little simple things that are really not that time consuming. You do that first, then you move on to your activity. Are you going to spend more time with your activity than with your wife? Probably. It's unrealistic to assume that you're going to quit your job and spend the entire day with your wife. I'm not asking you to do that, but I'm saying you take care of relationships first. It doesn't take that much time or energy to do that. Then you move on to your activity. Now, even though your wife may be sitting there thinking, yeah, he needs to start doing this and he should have been doing it all along, I understand perfectly that this is difficult for some Asperger's men to do. I'm totally on the same page with you with that. But here's how I can make it easier for you. You tend to be task-oriented, right? More than relationship-oriented. So all you do, and this is kind of a head game that you play on yourself, is you turn this into another task. Now your relationships are a primary task. Put it on your to-do list if you need to. This sounds ridiculous to your neurotypical wife, but your to-do list is in the relationship category can look like this. Kiss wife in the morning. Call wife at lunch. Give wife a hug and ask about day after work. Take wife to breakfast Saturday morning. If you need to write it out like that, along with all your other tasks, hey, more power to you.
Hey guys, this is Mark, and I got a brief video for the NT spouses out there to explain why your ASD spouse may be hypersensitive to criticism, even constructive criticism, and sometimes he or she may even download your neutral comments as criticism. So, one, certain childhood experiences may lead to greater sensitivity. For example, a child who received constant harsh criticism or consistently mixed messages from his parents, caretakers, teachers, and so on, or someone who had difficulty getting along with peers, or someone who did not receive positive reinforcement for accomplishments, or whose sense of competence and confidence was not fostered or allowed to flourish, is likely to have difficulty receiving and processing criticism in a healthy manner. Furthermore, when a parent has unrealistic high expectations of a child or overprotects the child from any disappointment or criticism, this too may lead the child to become more sensitive to criticism as an adult. Number two, a cognitive bias that leads the ASD individual to interpret ambiguous information in a negative way may also contribute to his or her sensitivity to criticism. Some people are more sensitive to criticism than others due to this cognitive bias that leads them to interpret ambiguous information negatively rather than in a neutral or positive manner. Now, a sensitivity to criticism describes not only the person's reaction to critical feedback, but also his ability to understand or interpret criticism. A person who experiences a greater sensitivity to criticism may be more likely to experience a decrease in motivation to cooperate, and he or she may also want to avoid further opportunities for criticism to potentially manifest, which means he or she may not want to engage in any conversations that are reminiscent of past conversations where they downloaded their NT spouse's message as insulting. And of course, low self-esteem can make one very sensitive to criticism. Mind blindness, emotions blindness, some executive function deficits, anxiety, problems with prediction, all of those can also at some level contribute to a hypersensitivity to criticism. Having said all that, sometimes criticism is negative and hurtful, and criticism that's intended as a personal attack can be harmful. So when criticism is excessively harsh, it's nothing short of being full-blown, unadulterated bullying. Hey guys, this is Mark. Click on the join button underneath any of my videos, then click on members only videos, and then click on join. And for $9.99 a month, you'll have access to members only videos, which are excerpts from previous workshops I've conducted for NT partners, ASD partners, and the neurodiverse couple. New videos will be uploaded weekly. Hey, this is Mark Hutten. Would you like to schedule a one-on-one Zoom call? Okay, it's so simple. Just look under any of my videos in the description area. Click on this Calendly link. Now you see my calendar. Pick your month, your day, anytime that's available.
Enter your name and email address. Then you'll get a follow-up email with the Zoom link on the day and time that you picked. And voila, we will talk.